on this computer. All right. Well, Don, thank you for joining me. This is the first of what I hope to be a series of recorded conversations about your involvement in what is now commonly referred to as social entrepreneurship. I'm sure when you were doing that in your career, dating back decades ago, nobody used that term or even thought about the possibility of there even being graduate schools that teach social entrepreneurship now. But it all fits in the framework of people who want to, through their individual initiative, build organizations and achieve social change, right? Sometimes from scratch. And I happen to know as your son, you have a long history in doing that. Again, you didn't have a label attached to it at the time that you were doing it. And I thought it'd be interesting for people to be able to watch these conversations and share the experiences of someone who had such a deep career in social change. Today, what we want to do is we want to set the stage for those conversations by going back into your growing up and how that experience growing up basically set you up to do the things that you did. And I want to say as a preface to that, I mean, what people are going to hear through these conversations is that you achieve social change almost just through going out there and doing it in ways that I find amazing, that you were able to achieve what you did almost out of whole cloth, right? And I think those experiences are really powerful for people to understand and hear from. But let's start at the very beginning. So you were born in East Lansing, Michigan in 1934. Tell me a little bit about the household into which you were born into and what the climate was like for you as particularly as a child growing up in that setting.
Michigan in the 1930s, when I was growing up, was in the middle of a Great Depression, of course. My parents were both teachers, both my father full-time at Michigan State University. Back in those days, it was, I think, Michigan Agricultural College or something before it became MSU. And my mother was a math teacher. She taught part-time at the university and part-time in high schools in the Lansing area. So both my parents were teachers, and we had a thoroughly middle class for the time background in Michigan at that point. Michigan at that time was, East Lansing, Michigan was a very white Protestant world at that point. We didn't have a whole lot of color in the community, not much diversity. That didn't really begin to happen until the end of the Second World War, when under the GI Bill, a lot of guys came back to school, and women, of all kinds of backgrounds, and we suddenly had a much more diverse community beginning about 1945 than we had when I was growing up. But it was a very comfortable middle class kind of background in a university town, with all the attributes of activities and benefits and cultural events and stuff that one would have at that point. So I had a rather privileged childhood, comfortable, the Depression notwithstanding. I mean, we had gas rationing during the Second World War, but that just meant we didn't, take long vacation drives during the Second World War. We were pretty much living at home. It was comfortable. We did not have any of the downsides of poverty or anything else that I can recall at all. We had rationing during the Second World War, like everybody else did, but we were comfortable. It was a very comfortable middle class background. I was an only child. And certainly spoiled in that respect. Didn't have a lot of competition in the house among other kids. But growing up in a house where both my parents were very busy much of the time. So I was very basically self-dependent. I had to amuse myself. I had to invent things for myself. I became an avid reader at a very young age. You got a library card. They let me take out stacks of books when I was a little kid. And I lived in a bedroom on the second floor of our house that was almost like an enchanted place. I could spend days in there reading and escaping to anywhere on the planet I wanted to read about. And back at a time when travel around the world was not as easy as it is today. At Michigan State, back in those days, on Saturday evenings, there was a travel adventure series available for students and faculty, freebies, in which people would come every Saturday with a documentary film of some sort, black and white, no sound, and the producer of the film would be on a podium on one side of the stage and would kind of narrate the film while it played. And it would be a 1 to 2 hour film. And I remember seeing films on Africa and Asia and all kinds of exotic places back at a time when people did not regularly travel to those places.
Right.
Back in the days when National Geographic was really an exciting magazine.
Right.
You went places and you saw things you would never in your lifetime see. So this was the kind of world, it was a very exciting world. I love going to these travel adventure series on Saturday night and to see Frank bring them back a live buck from Africa, bring in, and other people showing films. It was a very exciting time. I was very privileged. And we
Let me interrupt you there. And
sure.
Let me interrupt you there. And a couple other things I know from your childhood that I just want to point out. First off, you had a grandfather and a father who were really good at doing things, building things. They were like the kind of people who could go out and build stuff that today would be very amazing. So I feel like you grew up in a family where there was this notion that if something needed to be created, you would just take your hands and go and make it. Can you remember some of the things that your grandfather and your father made?
Well, my grandfather was a metal worker, and he made everything from furnaces to water towers to kitchen implements of all kinds. He was a very skilled craftsman in metal. What my dad grew up doing, having grown up in that kind of a blue collar, factory make it kind of background. My dad became a jack of all trades. He was pretty good at electrical stuff and plumbing and carpentry and everything you can think of. Very scientific in the way he went about stuff, measuring things very accurately and learning, schooling himself in what he needed to know to be a carpenter or whatever else. He picked up skills very quickly and probably had most of them as a young man. But my dad in particular was one of those guys who could build an awful lot of the stuff in the house. He could build furniture if necessary, tables. And if we had an electric train set, he could easily organize the large table on which it rested and organize the whole construction of it. Very skilled guy. They were both kind of guys that, and my mother also growing up in the 30s especially was very skilled in terms of knowing how to grow vegetables and farm and produce food for us, bake and all that kind of stuff. These were people that had lots and lots of skills back in those days when you didn't buy as many things prepared already at the grocery store, when you had to make more from scratch. I mean, my mother made cakes from scratch. She made pies from scratch. Everything was done, from the beginning to the end, the long, elaborate way back in those days. And she was very skilled also at all the chores and things you have to be a master of to run a successful house back in those days. But what I mostly remember them giving me was just lots of freedom. Maybe even more than I even understood at the time, because they were both working. And we frequently had a young university girl living with us in the house, and part of her room and board, if you will, consisted of being there as a babysitter when I was young, when my parents weren't around. But she didn't interact with me much. I mean, she was just there as an adult. But I was in my room living all kinds of fantasies as a boy and reading all the books at the time, war books, Second World War stuff about pilots and, all the exciting stuff that kids enjoy. And just having a lot of freedom to explore my own head and understand the world through the eyes of many, many people who I was reading at the time.
So there's something else I've seen in photos you shared with me, which is that your family had a pretty active outdoor life. Like you went out into nature, right? There's photos you showed me of around lakes, boats. Oh, Dad, you froze. I don't know why you froze. I don't know if you can hear me or not, but the iPad froze. I'm going to text Jessica, see if she can fix this. Oh, there you are. You're back.
Okay. Back.
Yeah, it was probably on my end. So there's pictures of you and your folks at a lake with a boat, doing things like that. So there was something of an active outdoor life as well, right?
Well, my folks had at least a cabin in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan every year, except when the war years cut back on gas and we couldn't get there. Up near St. Ignace, Michigan, about 15 miles west on US 2 along the northern shore of Lake Michigan. And so we spent a lot of summers when I was growing up in that cabin that was really primitive with wood stoves and outhouses and all that kind of stuff. And fishing, My dad and I did a lot of fishing for perch and bass, and my dad built a catamaran while we were there. A very primitive catamaran, a pontoon, a couple of pontoons with a raft on top of them, and a single mast with wires to four corners to keep it from breaking, and one sail. And we sailed that catamaran up and down the coast in pretty good waves, as a matter of fact, very stably. But he could build things like catamarans, and he could do stuff like that. But we had those kind of summers were exciting and fun, and I enjoyed them as well, and got to see a lot of the Great Lake country because of the vacation time on the Upper Peninsula. But mostly, I just a lot of freedom, just a lot of freedom.
So, and you went to public school, right?
I went to public school. I didn't like it much. The high school I went to in East Lansing, a university town, was a very jock kind of high school, even in those days. Very focused on athletics, football and basketball and baseball. And I was not a jock. I was relatively small when I was growing up compared to a lot of my classmates, and not at all athletically inclined. And in a school where that was important, if you were a guy and you wanted to be popular, you sort of had to be one of the guys that was on the football team or something.
Right, wearing a letter on your jacket. That classic letter on the jacket, right?
I was none of those things. I was studying Latin. I was doing all the other kind of intellectual stuff. I liked music. I took part in, we had operettas in high school, and student prints and Gilbert and Sullivan kind of stuff. And I took part in all those kinds of activities. But that was not something that got you lots of attention with the girls in school.
Let me back up. Let me back up.
A biggie either.
Let me back up and ask you, before we get to what happened at the end of high school, because I know where this goes as you get later in high school. I want to talk about, I think, the single most remarkable aspect of your childhood. But just to back up, so basically kindergarten through portion of high school, you were in the public school system.
Yes,
right? But it was a college town. So it was a college town's public school system. But
it was a good public school. Academically, it was a public school system.
Do you remember any particular teachers before high school who had an influence on you in any way?
Well, there was a music teacher named Grua, Ramo Grua, that I admired a great deal. Very creative guy. There was a Latin teacher, Charles Syme, who was very studious and very much into the subject. Remarkably so for a small public high school in Michigan at that time. Yeah, there were some teachers that really impressed me with their passion for what they were into, and I enjoyed. But I had reached a point by the time I was a junior in high school where if I couldn't get the hell out of there, I wasn't even going to go back to school. I really disliked school that much.
Let's stop there. We'll get there. I want to ask you, I want to just, because this is still the aspect of your childhood I find the most remarkable, and you're the only person I know, except for maybe one other person my entire life, who can tell this story. So I know that at some point you cut a deal with your folks that during the summers when you were in high school, you could go out into the world and go anywhere you wanted, provided you were back in time to start school in the fall. When did that start, and why did that happen?
I don't know why it happened. I know when it happened. It happened probably when I was about 15 years old. And for a couple, 3 summers while I was still living in East Lansing, apart from the week or two I might spend with my folks in northern Michigan if they went up for a cabin at sometime, I would take off and hitchhike with my parents' permission all over the Great Lakes country. And I would leave in June, and I would come back Labor Day weekend in time for school to begin that fall. And I would work in basically tended to be second-rate resorts and stuff where I could get a job washing dishes or waiting tables or whatever the hell, 2 weeks at a time, and kind of move around from job to job to job, hitchhiking all the time, and explore the countryside. And I worked my way one summer all the way up to Copper Harbor at the very end of the Keweenaw Peninsula in Lake Superior. Worked at a place called McGinty's Resort, a fishing resort up there for part of the summer. One summer, I worked my way gradually all the way up in Canada on Kings Highway 17 to the Montreal River, which was where the road stopped at that point on the eastern shore of Lake Superior, and worked all kinds of weird jobs. But I can't even imagine why my parents let me do that. Looking back on it, it was just astonishing that at 15 or 16 years old, I could pack some stuff into a backpack of some sort. Yeah, a few pairs of socks and underwear and a shirt or two, and hitchhike, just leave without any particular plan, just to see where it took me. See where the ride went, and and uh, and my parents would not know where the hell I was for months at a time.
Right. There's no cell phones. There's none of this modern technology of communication. Telephone calls are fantastically expensive.
I
Like to
didn't
make a
have
long
telephone.
distance call was a mint. How
Yeah,
far south in the United States did you get? I know you talked about
I went
going
to
north.
Arkansas one time during this. I went to visit an uncle in Berryville, Arkansas, on one of these summer excursions. But most of them were in the Midwest. The
Yeah.
one in Arkansas was the farthest south I ever went. I went to Mammoth Cave in Kentucky
Hmm.
at one point on one of these excursions. Um, and I mostly, though, I went up into the northern part of Michigan and Canada and worked resorts and stuff like that. I was very fascinated by a character that named Nick Adams that Hemingway wrote about, a whole bunch of short stories, the Nick Adams stories. And Hemingway and Nick Adams were at that time based in northern Michigan. Nick Adams was a northern Michigan creature of his imagination, and Hemingway had grown up in that country himself. And I sort of wanted to be Nick Adams when I grew up. He was a kid that had lots of adventures and wandered around and did things. And I walked the banks of the Big Two-Hearted River in the footsteps of Nick Adams. I fished for smallmouth bass in Walloon Lake in the footsteps of Nick Adams, kind of following his fictional career to some extent. But I'm just astonished right now that my folks let me do that. I mean, I'm now a parent. I went through, you were my son. I can't imagine ever allowing you to just vanish for months at a time. Uh, and I was an only child, and it seems even more unusual given that fact. And I don't know why my parents let me do that. Astonishing, my mother let me do that. My dad, I can more understand because I think he appreciated independence and people, and maybe thought I was going to learn something from this experience. But I don't remember any resistance from them. And I don't know what I would have done if they had not let me. Maybe they let me do it because they figured I would do it with or without their blessing. That if they didn't let me, I would just suddenly just disappear one morning with a backpack. I have no idea. I've never able in my later years with my father, I never had that discussion. I kind of regret that, to ask him, why did you let me do that? Not complaining, because for me these were golden times. I have lots of good memories of particularly McGinney's Resort in Copper Harbor. I mean, just strange place to be, and
It must have been very empowering to you, the idea that you could just get up and go someplace, you could get some work, you could make it work, right?
I learned I was bright enough. I was a quick study, even though I hadn't done a lot of the jobs I was getting when I got there, washing dishes even. And McGinney's, I became a cook for a while. The guy that was the main cook in this fishing resort got lost in the woods and got badly bitten by deer flies, ended up in the hospital. And for best part of a week, I substituted as a cook in the kitchen, cooking fish the guys had caught when they would bring it back.
Right.
The thing I learned about a lot of those similar experiences was that there was no real mystery to an awful lot of jobs. A lot of jobs you could learn to do pretty quickly, and you could fake it if you didn't even know what you were doing a lot of the time. And you could bullshit your way into saying, yeah, I've done that before. Tell the boss you're much experience. I gained a kind of confidence that I could do almost everything that was available to me without too much trouble. And so I didn't panic at the notion of tackling things I had never done before.
Yeah.
It was just kind of an interesting learning curve to have to deal with it. But I got a lot of confidence from that. I mean, there was almost nothing I couldn't go out and short of brain surgery or something to do. But I could be almost anything I wanted to be, just by being it, by taking the job and doing it. So it was a great experience in independence, self-survival, hitchhiking, no problems, wandering into a new town and with the confidence I could find a place to stay and a job and never failing. I mean, I always had a place to stay and I always had a job. Not high paying, certainly low level jobs, but they were not hard to find, and places to flop were not hard to find either. So I did very well in those summers. Have a lot of memories. Feel good about that. But why the hell they let me do that, I'll never understand. I'll be grateful. I'll be grateful to my grave that they gave me that opportunity when I was a kid.
So let me turn to, before we talk about the end of your high school years, I want to talk about something that happened in the midst of that, which I see as really interesting in your journey towards social entrepreneurship. At some point, around 16 or 17, you became a national spokesperson advocating for driver's education in high schools, right? In schools. Tell me how that happened and why it happened.
Well, Michigan was the center of the car culture when I was growing up. Detroit, Lansing, Oldsmobiles are made in Lansing, right where I live. Buicks and Flint, everything you can think of in Detroit. Michigan was the center of a great booming car industry at the end of the Second World War. And it was also a time in which an awful lot of working class people, through unions and everything else, were developing enough income that there was a growth in the middle class in America at that time. It included the upper end of the blue collar world. Mm-hmm. And so all of a sudden, people not only had enough discretionary income to own cars, they had enough money to own a couple of cars. And kids began driving. Kids began having cars at the end of the Second World War. And there was carnage on the highways as a consequence at the time. An awful lot of very bad accidents in which kids either killed themselves or other people, or maimed other people. An awful lot of really bad things were happening on the roads as a consequence of the sudden growth of the business of a lot of teenage kids having access to cars. And nobody seemed to be doing anything about it. It just bothered me that this carnage was going on. And so I found myself all of a sudden, without any particular plan, going to school board meetings and to city council meetings where you had a chance to go to a microphone and address the board or whatever, with a question or a problem or something. And I began speaking out about the need to do something about this. We needed to find some way to figure out a way we could provide some instruction for teenage kids in driving that might mitigate the kind of carnage that was going on around us, and that nobody seemed to be accepting any responsibility for that. And I didn't think that was appropriate. And it felt to me at the time that the automobile industry itself should basically play some voluntary role in this, since they were the ones benefiting financially from this boom in the automobile business. And after 2 or 3 of these appearances before city councils and school boards and things in the Lansing area, I got noticed by some people that were in the safety business. And they began buttonholing me and asking me to come speak to groups and things around the country. And I suddenly found myself on the chicken and peas circuit as a motivational speaker at 15, 16 years old, largely addressing state and ultimately national conventions of automobile dealers, sometimes insurance people, because I was also encouraging insurance people to give reduced rates to teenage drivers who had gone through credited driver education programs. But what I began doing was basically hustling the automobile business to get into the voluntary business of providing cars to high schools from dealerships as a charitable contribution in consort with the manufacturer of the car, because ideally these cars should have dual control systems in the front.
Right.
And I persuaded car dealers, beginning in Lansing, that it was in their interest to do that they could get enough benefits from the tax write-offs, expenses, public relations of having their name on the side of the car, all the goodwill they would incur from parents and people in town to provide this vehicle for the school. Branding. If a kid learned to drive in a Plymouth, maybe he'd be able to buy one when he got to the point he could buy a car. I was able to persuade dealers increasingly, beginning ultimately with a big Dodge dealer in Detroit named Jack Rose, that there was actually a good financial sense for the dealers to begin playing a role around the country in developing driver education programs at high schools that they were the primary financial benefactors of, because most high schools did not have budgets for this or inclinations to do this.
Right. Let me stop you there. I want to show, if anybody sees, I want to show one piece of proof about this. I'm going to share my screen. Give me a second here. And I believe people will be looking at a postcard that you recently had created that shows you, I believe, in New York City at a related event in front of sort of a staged photo with Colleen K. Hutchins, Miss America 1952.
That
right?
is a very, very distinct memory of mine. The last major appearance I made as a motivational speaker, I was the headliner at the National Automobile Dealers Convention, the National Convention in 1952, February of 52. It was held at the Waldorf Astoria in New York City. And so I was there for a long weekend as the headline speaker, addressing nationally all the car dealers that were there, promoting their contributions to driver education programs and trying to get them going all over the country. Colleen K. Hutchins was there because part of her contract as Miss America, she had to make a number of convention appearances in the course of the year of her wearing the crown. One of them was at this convention at the Waldorf, so she was there. And so we ultimately hooked up in a totally innocent sort of way to go to a number of these events together where we were expected to make appearances. And she appreciated my being there. So we spent more than just this particular occasion at an automobile antique show of some sort at the Waldorf. She was there by herself, and the Miss America people had not given her an escort. And if you can imagine the perils of being Miss America by herself
right.
at an automobile dealers convention in New York with a lot of drunk automobile dealers from out of town without their wives.
Oh, nice. Yeah.
She was looking at a lot of problems. And so she appreciated having a man on her arm that she could rely on to basically keep the worst of that from happening. So we basically spent some time together that long weekend at various events. I think in part to protect her from being unnecessarily harassed by car dealers who wanted to show them her etchings or their etchings in their hotel room or something. Well, so it worked out very nicely. But I had a lovely weekend with Miss America 1952 at the Waldorf at a variety of events, which was every teenage boy's fantasy. You know, right. Be on a date with Miss America when you're 17 years old in New York City. But there
now, let me stop there. I'm going to stop this screen share. Nobody's shown that picture. A couple things to point out. As you're traveling around the country doing these motivational talks about driver's education, again, you are unescorted yourself, correct?
Well, they kind of watched me because I was underage, so they tried to keep me from harm's way. And they had a guy who was sort of keeping track of where I was and making sure I was safe. But I was underage. But I was, they put me up in a hotel room,
right?
And all I got. Well, I didn't get paid for this. I think I got occasionally war bond gifts and things from various organizations. I wasn't getting paid. I was getting my expenses covered. But I was not getting paid any money for this motivational stuff. This was just public service kind of stuff on me. And when I began doing it, I had no idea where it was going to go. I mean, I didn't start this process with any understanding of where it might lead. I was, in fact, kind of startled at the fact that I got picked up and began appearing nationally, Mackinac Island, Chicago, New York. I was all over the place talking to car dealers mostly and being well received by them, actually.
Yeah.
But I never knew where it was going to go, and I was sort of startled. One of the little side things that happened out of that, I began doing public service spots on television. The Paul Whiteman Show, he was a big band leader back in those days. We're talking the golden days of early television, black and white live television. Sid Caesar, Show of Shows kind of time. And the Paul Whiteman, he had a teen talent show, a 1 hour, it might have been a half an hour, I can't remember, a teen talent show that broadcast out of Philadelphia live and once a week. And on a number of occasions in the course of that year, which would have been 51, 52, I made public service spot announcements live on the Paul Whiteman Show. I would be taken down from Andover, where I was going to prep school, to New York to Philadelphia, and would appear and briefly before the camera in the middle of the show and do a brief public service spot speaking to kids. At that point, a lot of driver ed programs were up and running around the country. And what I was doing at that point with the Paul Whiteman Show was urging teenage kids to take advantage of it, get involved, learn to drive safely. you'll get benefits out of this, including reduced insurance rates and maybe save your own life
Right.
if you
Right.
understand how dangerous cars
Exactly.
can be. And so I was doing public service spots with some regularity, getting paid in war bonds again by the Paul Whiteman show, and expenses paid. So I was doing early television, actually early black and white television, way back when, 1951, 52 kind of time. Same general period that I was at the Waldorf with with Miss America.
Let me stop you there. I just want to observe a couple things up front about what happened to you in this experience, how I see it. So what I see is a really interesting approach that I see we're going to talk about in future conversations. You recognized a couple things. One, you recognized that there were dangling incentives in the system that were not being used. But the incentives were what we call win-win incentives. Everybody wins, right? But they're not being recognized. I mean, like what you did is you help people recognize this win-win. The students get driver's education and they get reduced insurance rates. The dealers get positive publicity for their products and possibly even brand attachment on the part of students wanting to drive particular brands of cars. The schools get something out of it, which is they get this they operate these programs without having to pay for the materiel, right? The material being donated to them, but it's still a huge benefit to the school to offer driver's ed, helps to solidify their connection to the community and the parents, right? I mean, it's leveraging all these dangling incentives, and I find that really interesting from a social entrepreneurship perspective.
I didn't start out with all of that full blown in my head. One of the things that happened as I began to speak at school board meetings in particular was the pushback I would get from the school board. Well, they didn't have budget to do this. They didn't have any capacity to finance something like that. Good idea. They thought a great idea, but they had no way to pay for it.
Right.
It became very obvious to me almost immediately that the only way this was going to get sold was if I could figure out a way to make it financially workable for public high schools. They have driver ed programs. So I began brainstorming myself and talking to people, and it quickly became apparent to me that the things you're talking about, the incentives, already were out there. They just weren't being utilized. That there was a way to do this that people were not actualizing. And once I made that transition, the whole thing began to fall into place very quickly.
Right. Because it's win-win. It's win-win, right?
Nobody had figured this out.
Yeah.
And the automobile industry at the outset was probably a little reluctant to even think it had an obligation to protect kids from killing themselves. Sure. But once they understood that there was a positive side to this in terms of good publicity for them, which would offset the bad publicity of kids getting mangled in car accidents, the industry was taking some responsibility to try to deal with this problem. It became a self-selling thing. I was amazed at how well received I was at dealership conventions, because it didn't take them very long to figure out that what I was pushing was a good idea.
Right, and fitting in with their own goals, which is to sell product. Now,
and that's why I kept getting invited. And it wasn't because I was being invited as someone trying to shove something they didn't want down their throats.
Right.
Being invited because they began to appreciate what I was trying to sell. And so I was I was preaching to the choir a lot of the time when I was there.
Well, what's interesting is that there was an opportunity to do that. Now, we're going to run a little short on time here. So in the interest of that, I want to push into two other things now. First is going to Andover Academy. So you, on your own recognizance, decided you had to exit the high school, the public high school in East Lansing, and put yourself into a different academic environment. How did you come to identify Phillips Andover Academy as the place to go? And talk to me about what happened to you, particularly in terms of your social sensibilities once you went there.
I discovered that there was a kid in my class at East Lansing High School whose father had gone to Andover. I didn't know anything about prep schools or private schools. I just knew I didn't want to go back to East Lansing High School. I was really fed up with the whole thing and just unhappy there. And there was a boy in my class whose father had been an Andover graduate, I learned. The boy himself was not Andover material. He was a C student, basically, a job. But his father obviously had some better rights, and his father was a very prominent businessman in the Lansing area in some capacity. Can't remember what, but he was rather well-to-do guy. And so I went and talked to this kid's father on my own initiative. My parents didn't even know I was doing this. I went and talked to the father and asked him how one went about getting admitted to places like Phillips Academy Andover, because I knew nothing about that. It's expensive.
Mhm.
And the father very kindly gave me a lot of good information and addresses and people to contact at Andover and everything else to begin the process of seeing if they would take me on as a student. And I learned there was a process I had to go through of taking like an exam, being interviewed, all kinds of things I had to go through, submit applications. And back in those days, Andover was still pretty expensive. It's prohibitively expensive now if you are not low income, where you get a free ride. I got a free ride in Andover. Back at that time, the prep school was trying to broaden its geographic base in the country and not just recruit kids out of the New England area, but get a broader representation from around the United States. Today, it's even bigger than that. They're now reaching out all over the planet. And when I get the Andover magazine now quarterly as an alumni, I'm impressed with the incredible diversity of nationality where kids are coming from all over the place. And they have an endowment that allows them to accept people without any concern about whether they can pay for it or not. It's not even an issue. They accept people on the basis of qualification. And the ones that can't afford, they give them scholarships. I went there on a full scholarship. I qualified, I discovered, and had taken an exam, had to, I had no idea what, I sat down, they asked me to write a review right then of the latest book I had just read. I had read Sinclair Lewis's Main Street, I think is the book that I wrote a review for my Andover application. But I stumbled through this whole process just out of desperation because I did not want to go back to East Lansing High School that fall. And I got admitted. My parents were not really involved in this process. Again, they let me do it, and they didn't question it or challenge it or say, no, you can't leave home. But they weren't involved in it, and it was just a question of this guy, his father at East Lansing, very kindly. I think I was almost doing what he wished he could have done for his son. Frankly.
Yeah. So you go there, and what I know, and I want to just emphasize here is that, you come from this middle class background. You got a lot of freedom. You were spoiled, as you put it, in many ways as an only child. You were sort of living, one might see, as the type of American experience that would not immediately connect you to some of the broader social concerns that we will see evident in future conversations. And you go to this private prep school that has a lot of extremely wealthy kids attending, legacy kids, probably a lot of legacy kids attending, whose families are sort of what we might call the foundational families of the upper class of America. And I get the sense from what you told me before that that was a little bit of a learning experience for you to be in that climate. Can you tell me sort of how that worked out?
I'd never been involved with a lot of very wealthy people before, kids from wealthy families, because we didn't have those in East Lansing. East Lansing was a middle class kind of town, with a few exceptional businessmen here and there that were wealthier than the rest, but it was not a place where you get exposed to lots and lots of extreme wealth. When I went to Andover, I was aware that an awful lot of the kids around me came from extraordinarily wealthy family backgrounds, which was a shock. I'd never been around the kind of money that these kids had access to, with cars and possessions and clothing and everything, and vacations. And man, this was a whole different world. It was also shocking in another respect. I spent my last year in high school at Andover, my senior year, and I was in what's called the honors dorm, Paul Revere Hall at Andover at that time was where the brightest of the senior class lived in terms of the ranking in the school, and like a whole 4-floor dorm full of kids that would have been valedictorians in their own high schools back wherever they came from. Very bright kids. I'd never before been plunged into a place where everybody around was extraordinarily bright. Growing up in East Lansing, I probably could have been valedictorian at my high school in East Lansing, but I'm suddenly living in a whole dorm full of valedictorians. of very bright kids, with a few exceptions to that. And that was a bit of a shock. I wasn't the smartest kid in the room anymore. I was smart, but there were smarter kids than I was
Sure.
in Paul Revere, and I was aware of that. Very challenging. It was shockingly difficult compared to what I've been going through in terms of requirements academically in a public high school. In fact, first couple of weeks, I was wondering if I was even going to survive academically.
Mm-hmm.
But what allowed it to happen probably was a lot of the confidence I had gained by just going off and doing things on my own anyway, and learning that I could master the trade, whatever it was. I had enough confidence in myself that if I really buckled down and dealt with it, that I could ultimately survive
Right.
Andover.
Get through.
I could do that, and I discovered I had a whole intellectual gear I had never used before.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't so much an area of my brain that was smarter; it was an area of discipline that I had never exercised. I simply worked at it harder. I really studied. I
Mm-hmm.
crammed. I read. I worked at the process of academia. And I discovered that I had the capabilities, if I really put myself, through the process of not only doing it, but doing it quite well. In fact, I could survive and compete with these other very bright kids in the dorm successfully.
Mm-hmm.
I just had to kick this extra gear in, which I had never used before, and was delighted to learn that I had, and it worked. And I did quite well competitively with all of these kids, largely in many respects because I may have worked harder than some of them did.
Yeah.
I had one advantage that some of them did not. The smartest kid in my dorm was a guy named Warren Harshman, now deceased. A really bright kid. Extraordinarily gifted kid. But like a lot of the other kids, he was gifted in many, many respects, including athletically. He was bigger and an athlete. And a lot of the kids in my dorm were very active in football, baseball, basketball, extracurricular activities. I was not. I took part in some club activities at Andover, but I was not involved in any athletic sports in any serious kinds of way, which meant I was able to concentrate on my schoolwork probably a little more freely than some of them could. And I took advantage of that. I geared up and probably outworked some of those guys academically.
Mm-hmm.
But I was extraordinarily gifted crowd. Harshman himself ultimately went on to Yale, Harvard, Princeton, somewhere, I don't know, one of those schools. Ended up in the CIA at a high level, running a covert agency program in the Soviet Union under the cover of being a tour guide for Americans visiting the Soviet Union. He ran a tour company. He also had a couple of restaurants before he died in the New England area that were apparently quite good. And Harshman spoke Russian and English and 14 other languages.
Wow.
He was a very skilled kid.
Let me stop you here, and because we're going to run out of time for this hour. I do get the feeling though that you came out of the Andover experience with a much heightened sensitivity to issues of inequality in America.
I discovered Karl Marx when I was at Andover. It was.
Oh, I lost you for a minute. Dad, I lost you for a minute. You might be able to hear me. I think it's on my end. Hold on. Come on. All right. I lost you for 1 minute. You're going to have to back up.
I discovered that these first time in my life I was in the company of lots and lots of very wealthy people with all of the privileges that go with that, which I had never really been exposed to before. And it was pretty extraordinary to understand the gap between them and the rest of us. And even the fact that Andover existed. It pissed me off that all schools weren't as good as Andover,
Right.
that the rich kids got to go to this incredible place where they went on with their lives, 14 steps ahead of the rest of us, just in base of the quality of education that they were able to have. But I also at Andover back in those days, that if you were a scholarship kid, they let the rest of the school know that you were a scholarship kid. So you were already part of a class system, which is probably no longer the case at Andover.
Right.
Scholarship kids had to do chores on campus as kind of a way of paying for their scholarship.
Oh, yeah, sure.
That the rest of the kids didn't have. the people bussing tables in the commons where we ate dinner, the waiters and the people working in the kitchen were scholarship kids. And so scholarship kids had jobs on the campus. The rich kids did not. And it was a kind of a caste system within the school.
Right.
Let everybody know whether you were a rich kid or a scholarship kid. I'm sure that's been abolished long ago. Because I came from the Midwest, and I think they thought everybody from the Midwest was a farmer. And I probably got up at 5 o'clock to milk the cows. The job I got at Andover was a paper boy. I delivered the Boston Globe to Andover rooms because kids subscribed to newspapers.
Early in the morning.
Early in the morning, before class. I mean, I had to get up at 5 o'clock and assemble and
Wow.
put the papers together and make the rounds and get that all done before time to go to breakfast.
Yeah.
So I spent 7 days a week getting up very early while I was at Andover.
Delivering the paper.
Delivering papers. I mean, I was a paper boy. And I didn't mind that. I'd have been happier if everybody at Andover had to do something. But I did not like the fact that the rich kids didn't.
And the poor kids did.
The poor kids did.
Right. So let's jump ahead. Let's jump ahead to one last thing. I'm going to skip over college because I don't think there's a lot. Knowing about your college career, there's not a lot I want to push on in this conversation. We may come back on it other times. I want to talk about you in the military as one of the last things that sort of set the stage. So I know that you basically up in the middle of what would have been considered sort of a middle-class college experience, you up in the middle of that volunteered to enlist in the Korean War. Talk about how that came about, what you were thinking, and then talk to us about what the military experience did in shaping how you basically looked at the world.
Well, when I got out of Andover in the summer of '52, I went to Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois, as my academic choice. I was sufficiently sour on the New England environment at that time that I just did not want to. I had academically, I could have gone to Harvard or Yale or Princeton probably, but I just wanted to get the hell out of New England at the end of that year. I was kind of soured on just the whole ambiance of the smugness of the rich kids from that part of the world. And if you weren't part of that elite, you just didn't count. So I was bailing out to the Midwest to go back, and Northwestern this way. And I worked for what turned out to be probably a Communist Party front organization called the Congress End Discrimination as a civil rights organizer on campus at Evanston when I got there. And their big issue at the time was the fact that Northwestern is the only private school in the Big Ten. They had quotas on blacks and Jews. They had housing discrimination problems with blacks and Jews. And I began involving myself in some of the organizing on campus to try to remedy that. I also got involved in that same process with opposition to the draft, which was a big deal in those days for kids. And my take on the draft was that it was unfair, that if we're going to have a draft, everybody should have to go. It shouldn't be just kids that don't have academic deferments, which is middle class or upper class kids, could avoid military service rather easily. And the poor, basically, often minorities, went and died in Korea. And so I was arguing on campus as a student organizer that the draft was unfair and that the academic deferment was unfair. And if we're going to have a war, we should either all have to fight it or stop it, but we should not basically only send poor people to go die in it. And I had reached a situation where the only honorable thing I could do at the end of that first term at Northwestern was to volunteer for the draft. I had foisted myself on my own petard, as you will, on that issue. I had kind of obligated myself to, if I really felt that strongly that everybody should have to go, I should waive my academic deferment and make myself available. So I called my draft board in Michigan and notified them that I was waiving my academic deferment. And they were perfectly happy to draft me. And shortly after that, in the early part of '53, I ended up on a bus to Fort Knox, Kentucky for basic training. And, I kind of, in a weird sort of way, ended up in a strange situation I would not normally have thought I would end up doing. but like everything else, I made the best of it. I plunged in and I survived the experience and I learned a lot. And I turned what could have been, a difficult couple of years into actually a rather enjoyable couple of years, where I traveled and got to the Arctic and saw the North Pole when it was still the North
Right.
Pole.
Let me just say for the record that you ended up getting assigned to the Army-run anti-aircraft base that protected Thule Air Force Base in Greenland, where we stored a bunch of nuclear-equipped bombers.
I was on detached duty with the Air Force as in the Army, as all the Army guys were at the Thule Air Force Base at that time. And I was in an operations detachment, and I was the radar Riley. I was the company clerk in a radar operations detachment on a mountain not too far from the base that organized the defense of Thule Air Force Base in case of a Soviet attack over the top. And spent most of my military tour up in that part of the world. And
north of the Arctic Circle.
Yeah, way north.
I actually have down the hallway here the certificate you received from the King of Denmark, certifying you as a Knight of the Blue Nose.
That was
for having
me.
lived above the Arctic Circle in Danish territory for more than 6 months.
That was me. I was there for about 13 months, and I had an enjoyable time. It was I was delighted not to end up in Korea, obviously, although I had no choice in that matter. They could have sent me anywhere they wanted to. I had no control of it. But I was perfectly happy with my Arctic assignment. I never anticipated going there, and I'm glad I had that experience. I saw the Arctic while it was still the Arctic, which it's not anymore.
Right.
And I got the GI Bill. When I came back, I ended up getting through college on the GI Bill, which was a great addition to my freedom to go to school. And then in old age, I've had VA medical care as a consequence of my honorable service and then in the military back in the Korean War time. So
let me stop here and last thing I want to ask you about. So when you think about, we're going to have a conversation next time about some aspects of the social entrepreneurship work you did in the American Southwest, a large portion of your career. When you look back at the Army experience, the military experience, how do you see it sort of shaping your functioning in the world? Did it change you as a person? Did it improve you? What did it do?
It reinforced my sense of being able to tackle problems and solve them that I would not have anticipated. We were in a unit that often had in the Arctic officers assigned to us that were non-compass menace. It was a place where they could take an officer and give him his first or another command assignment and then wash him out of the military on his efficiency report. And we had a series of officers in our operations detachment who didn't function. We had alcoholics and we had head cases. A guy would show up and disappear into his room and would not come out. He'd be in there drinking for months. And eventually an ambulance would show up from the base and they would cart him away. My point, man, we had a first sergeant most of the time I was there who just didn't care. He was just going to get out of the Army and he wasn't functioning. And so I was the clerk in the operations room, the headquarters, the office, without a functioning commanding officer and without a functioning first sergeant. And so I forged signatures on morning reports. I forged signatures on letters. I organized duty assignments. There were weeks at a time where, for all practical purposes, I ran the operation as a private, and figuring out solutions for problems that arose. Morale was a big issue. For example, nobody wanted to do KP work. Everybody hates KP stuff. It was a downer for morale to get periodically having to go in the kitchen and wash pots and pans. So I decided, we had a meeting of the guys in the unit, and we 30 some of us, that if we all chipped in $5 a month and put that in a pot, and somebody wanted to volunteer to be a permanent KP, he could go home at the end of the year with $5,000 or $10,000 in his pocket, freebies, tax-free, nice little slush fund to go back to the States with. We had no shortage of guys who were prepared to be voluntary KP permanently for that kind of money. And so we selected one of those guys and even had backups if we needed them. And the morale problem went away.
Right.
We still posted a phony duty roster, on the wall for KP duty because we had to do that. But it was just a phony piece of paper, and we had a permanent KP. We had a boiler room situation, we had a power plant. Nobody wanted to work in the boiler room. It was cold, miserable place to be.
Sure.
And we did the same thing. We raised money. We got a permanent guy in the boiler room. He made additional money by doing people's laundry back there because he had access to water.
Yeah. Yeah. Hot water.
So he went home with lots of money. So the two jobs nobody wanted to do, we filled by making them outside of military procedure, bonus jobs. The notion that the worst job should get paid the most money.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, you know the reason I love this story.
But the point is, these were problems that existed in the unit, and since nobody else was prepared to solve them, I took it upon myself to hold a meeting and suggest that we do these things, and was greatly appreciated by the guys around me who thought it was a great idea. But this was run totally outside the framework of military procedure.
Sure.
We just did not obey the rules, but we had a much better morale situation as a consequence, and the work got done much better than it otherwise would have been.
So I just want to, as we finish today, I just want to just relate this to the advocacy on behalf of driver education, right? Yeah. What you see here is a couple of things. One of which is there's a problem, and you don't see other people addressing the problem. It's not like you have to push people out of the way. Right. There's a void, and there's no reason not to go and fill it. Right. That's the first thing. And the second thing we see here is a tremendous sensitivity to incentives and to win-win solutions in which everybody basically can buy in because everybody's situation is improved, right? Yep. And it creates an organic functioning system that's very sustainable because people are all benefiting from it in a very powerful and positive way, right? Right. And it produces change that can endure, maybe not permanently. I know in the case of what happened in the Arctic that the military caught on to this and didn't like it, but that's not your problem.
That's why I left. I have no idea.
Yeah, but so listen, we're gonna finish out today with that, and when we come back in our next conversation, we're gonna start talking about the things that you did, starting around 1963, 62, 63. Okay, we'll jump to there. I don't think what happens between that period of time is particularly important for this conversation about social entrepreneurship. So we'll jump to 62, 63 when you end up in New Mexico. I want to thank you so much for this chat. And we'll just pick it up as soon as we can for the next round, maybe a week or so from now. I'll be posting these videos on my YouTube channel. I'll give you, you can share the links. I'll give you ways to share the links with people who would like to see them. And other than that, I look forward to the next one of these, and we'll talk soon.
Okay, I look forward to it.
All right. Bye now.
Bye-bye.